I remembered the morning clearly because it started earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a knock that didn't sound casual. When I opened the door, my older brother, Michael Rourke, was standing there with his hands in his jacket pockets. He said he needed to talk, and the way he avoided eye contact told me this wasn't a normal visit. Michael had a long history of acting like everything was under control even when it wasn't. I had learned over the years to move slowly with him, especially when money came up. He walked inside and stood near the table, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He said he was trying to consolidate bills and needed a loan, but the bank required a cosigner. He said he didn't want to ask but didn't have anyone else. I listened, trying to understand the situation without jumping to conclusions. Our mother, Carolyn Rourke, had mentioned a few weeks earlier that he seemed stressed about something, so I wasn't surprised he was dealing with financial trouble again. But the urgency in his voice made me uneasy. Michael tried to explain that the loan would help him get back on track. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. I just told him we could go to the bank together so I could see the details myself. His shoulders loosened a bit, like he'd been afraid I would shut him down immediately. I didn't want to be dismissive, but I also didn't want to be pulled into something I couldn't see clearly. That balance had always been hard with him. We drove to the bank that afternoon. Michael stared out the passenger window most of the way, barely talking. When we walked inside, I noticed how he kept pulling at the cuffs of his jacket, a small habit he had when he felt cornered. He introduced me to the bank manager, who greeted us politely and asked a few standard questions. Michael stood beside me, quiet in a way that didn't match the confident tone he tried to use earlier. After a few minutes, the manager asked if he could speak with me privately. He didn't say anything alarming in front of Michael, just motioned toward a small office down the hall. Michael stayed in the lobby, pretending to look at brochures. When I stepped inside the office, the manager closed the door halfway and then said he wanted to give me the cosigner packet to look through carefully. His voice was calm, but something about the way he chose his words made me pay attention. He didn't reveal any of Michael's financial history. He didn't hint at anything specific. Instead, he said that anyone agreeing to cosign should take the paperwork home and review it without pressure. He handed me a folder and said there was no need to rush a decision. His tone wasn't dramatic, but it felt cautious. There was a slight pause after each sentence, like he didn't want to say something he wasn't allowed to. It was enough to make me think the packet might contain more than Michael had explained. I thanked him and walked back into the lobby. Michael saw the folder in my hands and asked if everything was fine. I said I wanted to read through everything that evening before making any decision. His reaction came fast. He told me the loan needed to be done the same day, and he said waiting would only make things harder for him. He didn't raise his voice, but the urgency sounded practiced, almost automatic. I told him I wasn't signing anything without reading it. We walked out to the parking lot. Michael stayed quiet, and I could see he was frustrated. He didn't argue anymore, though. He just said to let him know if I had questions. I said I would. On the drive back to my place, he sat with his arms crossed, watching the road ahead. It reminded me of other times when he wanted something to go his way but knew he couldn't push too hard. When I got home, I set the folder on the kitchen table and made another pot of coffee. The house felt quiet in a way that made me focus more than usual. I opened the packet and started at the top page. Most of it looked standard. Income questions, payment schedules, cosigner responsibilities. But as I moved through the pages, I felt myself slowing down. One line here and there didn't match what Michael had told me over the years. A few entries mentioned things he'd never brought up. Nothing was dramatic on its own, but the small inconsistencies built a kind of pressure in my stomach. Then I reached a page that made me stop. It mentioned a previous credit pre-approval where I was listed as a projected business partner. My name was printed clearly. Below it was a signature that was supposed to be mine. I felt my jaw tighten as I looked at it. It wasn't even close to my handwriting. I sat back in the chair and stared at the page for a long minute. The manager had said nothing about Michael's past activity, yet somehow he knew I needed to see this. His careful wording now made sense. He hadn't wanted to say something he wasn't allowed to, but he had made sure I didn't sign anything blindly. When I finally closed the folder, the room felt even quieter. I realized this wasn't just about a loan. Something else was happening, and the next step would depend on what I chose to do with what I had seen. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that signature on the form, the one that was supposed to be mine. I kept wondering how long it had been sitting in the bank system without me knowing. By morning, I knew I had to talk to Michael, but I also wanted to be clear on what I'd read. I went through the packet again over breakfast, page by page, trying to understand the timeline of what he had submitted. Before calling him, I decided to go back to the bank. I wanted to hear the manager's instructions again, this time with a clearer head. When I arrived, he greeted me politely, as if he already expected I might return. I told him I had reviewed the packet and found a page that didn't make sense. He nodded and reminded me that reviewing it slowly was exactly why he had encouraged me to take it home. His calm approach made it easier to ask the questions I had been holding. Back in the lobby, Michael was already waiting for me. He must have assumed I would stop there on my way to work. He didn't smile. He only asked what I had found in the packet. I told him we'd talk later, somewhere private. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, another small gesture he made when he felt cornered. I didn't want to have the conversation in public, so I told him I needed some time before we discussed anything further. Later that morning, he called twice. I let both calls ring through. The third time, he left a voicemail saying the loan office needed an answer and he didn't want to lose the approval. I could hear the frustration in his voice, but it didn't change the fact that something had been wrong with the paperwork long before he asked me to help. When I got home that evening, I finally called him back. I told him I had questions about a form in the packet. I didn't mention which one. I wanted to hear how he would explain it first. He said he didn't know what I meant and claimed the packet was standard stuff. His words sounded too casual, like he had practiced them. I didn't argue. I just said I would bring the folder with me the next morning and we could go through it together. He didn't respond right away. After a long pause, he said the manager had told him all the paperwork was up to date. That comment made me realize he was trying to push the responsibility onto someone else. I decided not to bring up the form over the phone. I wanted to do it in person, where I could read his reactions. Instead of meeting him that night, I sat down in my living room and looked through the packet again. The pages looked more tangled than before. Some dates didn't match stories he had told in the past. A few numbers didn't line up with what he used to describe as his income. Nothing was outrageously wrong, but the inconsistencies were steady enough to make me uncomfortable. The page with my forged signature stayed on the table for the longest time. I kept glancing at it, wondering how he thought I wouldn't find it, or maybe he hoped I wouldn't look closely at all. The idea bothered me more than the signature itself. Before going to bed, I sorted the packet into 3 piles, one for standard documents, one for forms that needed explanations, and one for the pages that didn't make sense under any circumstance. The forged page went on top of the 3rd pile. Looking at the 3 stacks made the situation feel more real. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a clerical mistake. Multiple pages pointed to the same pattern. The next morning, I drove back to the bank. I wanted to hear the manager's guidance again before confronting Michael. He invited me into the same small office and asked what I had found. I showed him the page with my name and the wrong signature. He looked at it for a moment, then asked if the signature was mine. I said no. His expression didn't change, but his voice grew more formal as he explained my options. He told me I didn't have to decide anything on the spot. He reminded me that filing a fraud affidavit was available, but only if I believed someone had used my identity. He didn't ask questions about Michael, and he didn't push me toward a particular decision. He only explained the process and said he understood why the paperwork raised concerns. When I stepped out of the office, I felt the weight of the folder more than the day before. I walked back to my car and sat there for a few minutes, thinking about how to handle the conversation with Michael. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately. Another part of me wanted to talk to our mother first. She had always tried to keep peace between us, but this wasn't something she could smooth over. By the time I started the engine, I knew what I needed to do. I would confront him directly, but I wasn't doing it alone. I needed the conversation to happen somewhere calm, somewhere neutral, somewhere he couldn't dodge the truth as easily as he did in parking lots and phone calls. I decided to meet him at our mother's house. It was the only place where I felt both steady and grounded enough to handle whatever he had to say. I drove to my mother's house the next morning with the folder on the seat beside me. The sun was just coming up, and the quiet of the early hour made everything feel heavier. I had called Michael the night before and told him to meet me there. He agreed, but his voice sounded tight, as if he knew the conversation wasn't going to go his way. I didn't tell him what I planned to bring up. I wanted to see how he reacted when the documents were right in front of him. When I arrived, my mother was already in the kitchen making coffee. She looked concerned when she saw the folder in my hand. I didn't give details, but I told her Michael and I needed to talk. She nodded and said she would stay close by if things got tense. It wasn't the first time she had watched us work through a problem, but this time felt different. She didn't know it yet, but the situation went far beyond unpaid bills or bad decisions. Michael showed up a few minutes later. He walked in without much eye contact and sat at the table like he wanted the conversation to be quick. I set the folder down between us and opened it to the page with the signature. He glanced at it and then looked away, as if he didn't recognize it. I asked him directly why my name was on a credit pre-approval form from months earlier. He shrugged and said forms got mixed sometimes, and maybe an old application got attached by mistake. The explanation didn't make sense. The signature was supposed to be mine. I asked him again, slower this time, how my name ended up on a document I had never seen. He said he wasn't sure. His voice was flat, almost practiced. The room felt small, and the silence between us stretched longer than usual. I could hear my mother move around in the next room, but she didn't interrupt. I told him I had gone back to the bank that morning and talked to the manager again. I said the manager had verified the document with my ID and confirmed that someone had submitted it using my information. Michael's shoulders tightened when he heard that. He didn't look surprised, but he looked caught. It was a different expression than frustration. It was closer to realization, like something he had been hoping wouldn't happen had finally arrived. I laid out the other pages that didn't make sense. Income statements that didn't match what he had told me in the past. Dates that conflicted with stories he had given our family. Small errors that pointed to the same conclusion. He glanced at each one but didn't say much. His eyes kept going to the forged signature and then shifting away again. After a long pause, he finally said he had been trying to get approval for a small business loan months earlier. He said he thought including my name would make the application look stronger. He said he planned to tell me if the business idea moved forward, but nothing had come of it, so he didn't think it mattered. He talked quickly, like he wanted to get it all out before I reacted, but even then he didn't admit he had signed my name himself. I asked him who wrote the signature. He didn't answer right away. He rubbed his hands together and stared at the table. My mother stepped into the doorway then, her expression tight. She didn't speak, but her presence made the room feel steadier. Michael finally said he might have filled in the signature space because he didn't think it would lead anywhere. He said it in a low voice, almost a whisper. It wasn't a full confession, but it was close enough. My mother sat down across from him. She looked disappointed, not angry. She told him she understood he had been under stress, but using my name without permission crossed a line. She said he needed to fix the situation before it caused real damage. Her voice didn't rise, but her words were firm. Michael kept his head down. I told him I wasn't going to co-sign anything. I said the forged form already created a problem that needed to be corrected. I said the manager had explained the fraud affidavit, and I would file it if I had to. He looked up at that point, startled. It was the first sign of real emotion I had seen from him that morning. He asked if there was another way. I told him the only other way was to go back to the bank with me and be honest about what he had done. He didn't answer right away. He sat back in the chair and stared at the documents again. The room stayed quiet except for the sound of my mother tapping her fingers lightly on the table. After a long minute, Michael said he would go with me. His voice was tired, as if he had finally realized he couldn't talk around the truth anymore. I gathered the paperwork and placed it back into the folder. My mother walked us to the door, and she touched Michael's arm as he passed, a small gesture to show she still cared even though she didn't agree with what he had done. Outside, the air felt heavier than before. I unlocked my car, and Michael got in without saying anything. As I pulled out of the driveway, I knew the next steps weren't going to be easy. But I also knew the situation couldn't be ignored. The morning had stripped away the last doubts I had. Whatever Michael had been doing with my name wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, and the bank had already seen it before I did. The drive to the bank that morning felt quieter than any drive we had taken together in years. Michael sat in the passenger seat with his hands clasped between his knees. He kept shifting his fingers, opening and closing them like he was trying to settle nerves he couldn't hide anymore. I didn't say much. I wanted to stay focused on what needed to be done. Emotion could come later. When we walked into the bank, the manager recognized us right away. He greeted us with the same calm tone he had used before, and it made the whole situation feel more manageable. He led us to the small office where he had spoken to me earlier in the week. Michael sat down slowly, as if the chair itself reminded him of everything he had been avoiding. I placed the folder on the table and told the manager that Michael had agreed to address the inaccurate filings. Michael nodded, but he didn't say anything at first. The manager waited, giving him space to speak in his own time. It took a moment before Michael finally admitted he had submitted the earlier pre-approval listing me as a projected partner. His voice stayed low, but he didn't try to shift blame or deny what he had done. The manager listened quietly. He didn't react with judgment or impatience. He only asked a few practical questions so he could make notes for the internal report. He then turned to me and explained the next steps. I would need to complete the fraud affidavit paperwork to make sure the bank documented the misuse of my information. It wasn't complicated, but it required accuracy. I took my time filling out each line. Michael watched, not interrupting. It was the first moment where I felt he understood how far the situation had gone. When the paperwork was finished, the manager reviewed the identity alerts the bank would place on my profile. He explained that these alerts would stop any future applications linked to my name unless I verified them personally. Hearing that made me feel both relieved and unsettled. I hadn't expected to need that kind of protection from my own brother. Once the documents were processed, the manager asked if I had any final questions. I asked whether the forged form had been the only issue. He paused before answering and then said there had been another attempt the previous week, an application where Michael had again tried to list me. Michael closed his eyes when he heard that. He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He just sat there with his hands pressed together, as if trying to hold himself steady. The manager clarified that the bank had closed both attempts and would block any others automatically. He also explained that Michael would be restricted from submitting new applications for a period. It wasn't a punishment so much as a protective measure. Still, hearing it spoken plainly made the situation feel more final. Michael apologized then, not loudly and not dramatically. He simply said he was sorry for putting me through this. He didn't look directly at me, but his voice had a weight to it that hadn't been there earlier. I didn't respond right away. I was still processing the shift from suspicion to confirmation. For days, I had been trying to understand whether he was overwhelmed, careless, or dishonest. Now I knew it was a mixture of all three. When we walked out of the office, the lobby felt too bright after the quiet room behind us. Michael followed me to the parking lot without speaking. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, like the effort of keeping up appearances had finally caught up to him. We reached the car and he hesitated before getting in. On the drive back to our mother's house, he said he hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He said he thought if one of the applications went through, he could fix his financial problems before I even found out. I didn't answer. I understood the reasoning, but it didn't excuse the choices he had made. He had crossed a line, and even though he admitted it, the damage had already been done. When we arrived, our mother was waiting on the porch. She looked at Michael first, and he shook his head slightly, as if to say she didn't need to ask. She put a hand on his shoulder and led him inside. I stayed outside for a moment, letting the air settle around me. I wasn't angry at that point. I was just exhausted. Inside, my mother asked how things had gone. I told her the bank had processed the corrections and everything was documented. She listened carefully, and I could see worry in her expression, not only for me but for Michael too. She said she hoped he would learn from this and start dealing with his problems in a more honest way. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what the next few months would look like. Michael sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands. He didn't try to defend himself anymore. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just sat there, quiet and unsure of what to do next. For a moment, I felt a mix of sympathy and distance. I cared about him, but I also knew things couldn't go back to how they had been before. Before leaving, I told him I needed space for a while. I said we could talk again eventually, but I needed time to rebuild trust, or at least understand what trust meant now. He didn't argue. He just nodded. When I walked out to my car, I felt a kind of stillness I hadn't felt all week. The situation wasn't resolved in a clean way, but it was contained. And for the moment, that was enough. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. I kept checking my email and my phone, half expecting some kind of update from the bank or a message from Michael. Nothing came. The stillness made it easier to think, but it also made the situation feel larger. Identity misuse wasn't a minor mistake. It had real consequences, and I didn't want to ignore that anymore. A few mornings later, I went back to the bank to finalize the last part of the identity alerts. The manager met me in his office again and reviewed the forms with me. Everything had been processed correctly, and the alerts were active on my profile. Knowing that helped settle a part of my mind. For the first time in days, I felt like I had some control back. Before I left, the manager said there was one more thing he needed to show me. He pulled up a record of recent activity linked to my information. The printout showed 2 attempts. The first was the pre-approval from months earlier, the one with the forged signature. The second was from just a week before Michael asked me to co-sign. It listed me as a co-applicant, but the form had never been completed. I looked at the dates carefully. Seeing them side by side made something clear. Michael hadn't acted out of sudden panic. He had tried attaching my name more than once, spaced months apart, hoping something might slip through. The manager didn't comment on the pattern. He simply confirmed the bank had closed both attempts and placed an internal note requiring manual review on anything connected to my name. His calmness helped me accept the information without letting it overwhelm me. When I walked out of the bank, the air felt cool and steady. The tension that had built up over the past week seemed to settle into something quieter. I didn't feel angry. I felt tired in a reasonable way, like someone who had finally reached the end of a long process. Later that afternoon, I drove to my mother's house to check on things. She was in the living room when I arrived. She looked relieved to see me, but also concerned. She asked how the follow-up went, and I explained what the manager had shown me. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said she hoped Michael understood the seriousness of what he had done. Her voice sounded steady, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Michael was in the kitchen when I walked in. He looked up from the table, and for the first time since the whole situation started, he looked unsure of himself. Not defensive, not irritated, just unsure. I told him about the second attempt the bank had found. He didn't react with surprise. He only nodded and looked down at his hands. That reaction told me everything. He had known about it all along. He apologized again, this time more quietly. He said he had been trying to fix his financial problems and believed listing my name would help him get approved. He said he thought he could make things right before anyone found out. His explanation didn't make the situation better, but it gave me a clearer picture of what he had been thinking. I didn't lecture him. I didn't raise my voice. I told him I needed time before I could trust him again. I said it wasn't about anger anymore. It was about boundaries. He nodded without arguing. It was the first moment where it felt like he understood the full impact of what he had done. Over the next week, I kept my distance. I checked in with my mother, but I didn't reach out to Michael. I needed space to sort through how I felt. The bank had handled the situation professionally. My identity was protected. But the emotional side of it would take longer to settle. Trust didn't rebuild overnight. It grew slowly, and only if the other person gave it room. One afternoon, while sitting at my kitchen table, I realized I felt something close to relief. Not because the situation was simple, but because the truth had surfaced before anything worse happened. The forged documents, the repeated attempts, the quiet warnings in the manager's voice. All of it had led to a point where the problem couldn't be hidden anymore. Michael and I didn't have a perfect relationship before all this, and we certainly didn't have one afterward. But we had a clearer understanding now. I cared about him, but I also needed to protect myself. And for once, I didn't feel guilty about that balance. When I finally allowed myself to take a deep breath, the house felt quiet in a calm way, not in a tense one. The situation wasn't pretty, but it was handled. And sometimes, that was the most anyone could ask for. Thank you for listening to my story on Courage Stories channel. Please like this story and subscribe to the channel if you liked the story.